Hello everyone, and welcome to the new episode about editing with Darktable. In this episode, I would like to address one request from one of the viewers of my videos, Josef Šmolík, who writes as following. When you switched from filmic to sigmoid, I was looking forward to better work. Unfortunately, for my portraits, I can't get the same or better results in sigmoid than with a filmic module. I make portraits in the studio, and with the sigmoid module, the bright areas come out terribly burned, and the color balance module is almost impossible to use to fine-tune the color contrast. Can I do one more episode on portrait editing with sigmoid, including all the other edits and this mode as well? I will be happy if you make some video on processing a photo with sigmoid from A to Z. I know that curves are no longer used, but I will say that in Darktable there were good results with them. Filmic is another step forward, but the sigmoid doesn't work for me. He was also very kind. Josef was also very kind to provide me with his own portraits that he has made, and I will choose this one for addressing those difficulties. So let's get started. First, we need to compare filmic and sigmoid to be able to see the differences between those two tone mapper modules, and that can help us later to address the specific features of the sigmoid module to get good results. Because sigmoid is my default tone mapper, I'll need to disable it now and enable filmic. And we already see the difference, but before we start to talk about that, we need to make some corrections. So I would like to make some lens correction, maybe denoising, and also color calibration. We need to white balance this photo. It's a little bit magentish. And I think we can use this part of the t-shirt of our model. And we can now talk about a little bit how to deal with contrast and colors in filmic. To improve the contrast of the photo, we can use filmic itself first. We have enough room in our dynamic range, and we can use relative white exposure and maybe a little bit black exposure, black relative exposure to get some contrast. We can also use in the look tab contrast slider to add a bit more contrast. I don't think we need too much. And now to address the saturation, we can use color balance RGB and just use the shadows and midtones, and maybe just a tiny bit of vibrance. We don't want to have too much saturation in the highlights. So it's approximately a good starting point with this approach. The second approach can be, I can make now a duplicate and turn back color balance RGB and filmic. It's also my preferred option to use just color balance RGB, not to touch too much the filmic, because sometimes you need that room to be able to add a contrast to your own liking, and color balance RGB gives you a nice opportunity to do that. With perceptual brilliance grading, for example, now we can go with these here sliders. We can just add a bit more brightness in the highlights, and maybe go down with the shadows and add a bit in the midtones. And same as before, we need to add some saturation, and we are good to go. The third option could be also let me try that. Let me disable the color balance RGB again. We can also use 4-ways tab. We have those 4 sliders that can be also useful to get a nice contrast. So we can use highlights gain and go up to add a bit more contrast or a bit more brightness in the highlights. Maybe power gain a little bit down, and shadows lift. Shadows and highlights gain are working on those areas power function works on whole dynamic range, but the main point is the midpoint, so you can shift it up and down. And now we have nice contrast, and we can go to the master tab and do our saturation thingy. And that is the third option. The fourth option that can be done is by using tone equalizer. So let me duplicate that again and disable color balance RGB. And tone equalizer is especially interesting for those people who have used to use curves, because you have the option to use tone equalizer similar to the tone curve. For example, if you go to the masking tab and disable detail preservation, you can use tone equalizer as a tone curve. There is also a preset that you can use directly, simple tone curve preset. So let's use that. And now the only thing that we need to do is to adjust mask exposure compensation so that we have most of the dynamic range covered with those 8 points. Now we can use, I will also suggest to add a bit curve smoothing so that you have smooth curves if you make adjustments. And you can go now, for example, here is the highlight, and just move the mouse wheel up to add some brightness. Maybe here in the shadows to bring it down, and midtones. And you can have a nice curve. And that is practically a nice option to use it as a tone curve if you wish. And now we can go back to the color balance RGB and add some saturation. And we're good. So this is practically 4 different ways that I recommend. My best way is just to use color balance RGB, but you have a ton other options also. And these are 4 most convenient ways to add some contrast and some saturation. Now let's see how can that be done with sigmoid module. So I don't want to edit the photo further. We will now switch to sigmoid to be able to see the difference. Now we have only one copy of the photo, and this is one where I have used color balance to adjust the contrasts and saturation without touching filmic. And now we can use this one to compare this with sigmoid module. So first we will take a snapshot, then I will make a duplicate, and we can now disable color balance RGB and also filmic and enable sigmoid. And I need to enable default scene referred default of the sigmoid module, so we can start from there. And now we can compare those two. The first thing that you noticed immediately is by enabling the sigmoid module default version, we already have a quite nice contrast and also saturation. We don't need to do much there. But there is a quite big difference if we watch this area here of the skin, the highlights. Now when we compare that with the filmic version, you may notice that this area is quite saturated. This is because the sigmoid uses another approach, or have another approach to color processing. A default version uses per channel color processing, and we have here much desaturated highlights in comparison to the filmic. And if you want to adjust that immediately, you can use the similar algorithm that filmic use. If you go to the per channel menu, you can choose RGB ratio, and you will have the similar algorithm for hue preservation. And now we can use color balance RGB as with filmic, add some saturation, and you're practically ready for further processing. Now, one more interesting thing that Josef have addressed is if you use color balance RGB, it's not easy to adjust the contrasts because it doesn't work quite well. For example, perceptual brilliance grading. But what works quite well to improve the contrast even better are four-ways sliders. For example, I would like to adjust a little bit more here the brightness in the midtones, and now I can use a power function, and I don't think you need to do anything else, and you have quite similar result as with filmic. Okay, I can also go use the global offset and reduce a little bit the black point down, maybe in shadows. And we, as you can see, have quite similar starting point as with a filmic. But how can we get good results by using internal channel color processing with sigmoid? So let's make one more copy of the sigmoid version here, and we need to disable color balance RGB, and also, or we just can turn on again scene referred default by sigmoid, and let's talk about those sliders a little bit. Now what we have here as options, we have contrast possibility. We can add contrast if we want, and we have the skew slider, which can help us to shift that contrast towards shadows or towards highlights. For example, if I want to have more contrast in the shadows, I can move that skew slider to the left, and immediately you can see I'm losing the saturation in the highlights even more, and the transition between the highlights and the midtones is much softer. And if I go into the other direction, I'm losing contrast in the shadows, but I'm adding, and you can also see how we increasing the dynamic range. I'm adding contrast in the highlights, and also I'm gaining a little bit of saturation there. So there is a trade-off between those two possibilities. But what you also can do, and that's the main reason, let's go back to the default version. The main reason why we're using the saturation here is because the target white is quite low intentionally to be able to have enough room to play with the contrast and skew sliders, and to be able to address the medium that you want to export your photo. And you can go above this soft limit just by pressing Control and Shift keys and go with the mouse a bit up. And as you can see, we can now increase the target white to the edge of the dynamic range, and we have also gained bit contrast there and also the saturation. As you may see now, we have this quite similar saturation with as with filmic version. Now the problem is, you see I'm already on the edge of the clipping, so we need to be very careful not to go too far with target white. And the other issue is, now if I want to add some contrast, I'm immediately clipping, so I need to use the skew slider to go down with to the left, so that the contrast is more in the shadows. So that is the trade-off that you need to know if you want to get that result. But now, as you can see, there is not big difference between those two sliders. Now you can improve it, of course, again with the color balance RGB. So let's do that real quick. I will add a bit more power, maybe go luminance here down. I don't know. I don't think we need to add much saturation, maybe just a tiny bit, because the sigmoid desaturates the highlights, and it's all already let's say set up to our perception. We don't need to use those sliders. We can just use global saturation a tiny bit, and we are good to go. So that is practically how can you set up your sigmoid module without playing too much. But we have another option. So let's see what can we do else here with those other sliders. What we also have here is preservation hue slider. Now look what happens if I go quite near in this area again, this area with our highlights, and if I move hue preservation to the 0, you may notice that we have a little bit of a color shift. So we have a color shift from the orange to the yellow a little bit. That can be quite useful, not in this case, but it can be kind of useful, for example, if you have something like sunset situation with high intensity sunset. So you want to shift the highlights a little bit from orange to the yellow, but not that much. So you can use this option. And you can also use the 3 primaries, or these 3 pairs of the primaries, to influence the saturation in the highlights and also the color shifts in highlights, to address some color shift in our perception, like Abney effect or Bessel-Brücke shift and so on. So you can, for example, deal with quite intense monochromatic lights like LED lights in a concert. I have already made one episode about that, so you can watch that. But in this case, I don't think we need to change here anything. And to be able to demonstrate what that does, maybe just one small demonstration, I will now add quite a lot of saturation in the highlights just to be able to see what happens. And now if I use, where do we have sigmoid? Now if you can use red rotation, for example, and watch what happens if I move the red rotation towards magenta. Now you see we have some magentish look here, and I can go in the other direction and everything will get even more reddish. And what I can also do, for example, I can desaturate the highlights even more by red attenuation. That can be helpful, for example, if you have a red, intense red rose or other red flower, you can remove some saturation from the highlights and get those details back that have been lost through the out of the gamut colors and so on. But for this case, I don't think we need to do anything in this case. So let's go back to the color balance RGB, bring that highlights to the 0. But what we can do now, that is quite important, as you may see, our model have differences in the colors in the skin. So it looks a little bit like as she has some kind of sunburn, although that's not the case. But you can see we have here in these areas a bit more, let's say, magenta-ish, orangey than, for example, in those areas. We need to balance that a little bit. Now what we can do, we can use RGB primaries for that. And RGB primaries have a similar function as in sigmoid module, but those sliders work for the whole dynamic range. So we are not, it's not only for the highlights. So now what I would like to do is, for example, to balance those colors, I can now use red hue and shift the whole hue a little bit to the yellow. Now we have a bit yellowish color, and we can also compensate that by using green hue and shift it toward the red, so that all those yellow parts are getting a bit more orangey. Now to be able to see what is happening, and now I will use the vectroscope and maybe turn that off to see the difference. Now if I move red hue to the yellow, you see how it moves in this direction. And to compensate that, I can now use green hue and move it back. So we have a bit tighter. We don't have that big difference between yellow and orange and red in the skin. No, the skin is a little bit, let's say, monochromatic. You see before and after. And we have lose some saturation, so we can also add some purity here in both primaries. And now we have a bit better skin color of our Roman. Now what else need to be done? I will maybe use also contrast equalizer, because I would like to address this quite high glowing area. And I will just use that coarse part of the local contrast and lower it down a little bit without losing the sharpness. So the fine part we can leave as it did. As you see, now we have a bit more smooth transitions in the skin, and maybe I can use one more one instance of diffusion sharpen, bring it above contrast equalizer, let's say there, and add some sharpness. I can use just standard preset sharpen, demosaicing a filter. I think it will be enough. And we have practically now readjust the colors and also the contrast. I don't think we need to do that much. What else we can do? We can now even more balance our skin color. And I think we can use for that retouch module. Let's use it real quick. And for that, I don't want to go to every detail. I don't want to remove the blemishes and other skin correction except for the color, because it will take that much time. What we only want to do is to balance the color even a bit more. And now what we can use that fill tool, and instead of erase, we can use color, and then sample a nice part of the color with a color picker. I don't know what kind of color we will use. Maybe, I don't know, let's use this one, this color here, and try to apply it everywhere. So now we can use the mask and mask the whole area. The first one, maybe a few more. Let's use this one again here. I can use all those areas. I can add a mask on all those areas that have the different color. And now we can leave the opacity quite low, and I don't want to influence the brightness. So what I can do, I can now use blend mode, chromaticity, just to influence the chroma of the skin. So as you may see, we have now just a bit addressed a little bit the color of the skin to be able to see it better. Maybe we can add a bit more opacity and just try. And now if I disable it, you see we have that let's say burned skin color, and we have removed it, and now we have more balanced color of the model. And what else we can do? We can also, I don't know, maybe we can, what I'd like to do, because we have here the black background and white t-shirt, so that warm colors are dominating here. What I can do, I can go to RGB primaries and maybe influence the whole image a bit more just by adding some colder tint to the whole photo, something like that, just to balance that warm colors. As you can see, that's about the difference. I don't know, maybe we can add a bit more, or we can add some vibrance and maybe a bit more saturation, so about there. Of course, we could use the retouch module also to address all those blemishes, but I don't want to spend that much time. I think it's now enough. So let's compare that with filmic. As you can see, what we also can do. No, I think that's enough. And if you have a more freedom, I will also maybe add a bit split toning to the photo. So what I mean with the split toning, I will explain just in a moment. I will just add one more duplicate so that we have original untouched. And what I would like to do, I will add one more instance of the color balance RGB and use the 4-ways tab. For example, I would like to add a bit difference in the shadows and in the highlights in the tone. So I go to the shadows and add some hue here, maybe some kind of reddish orange, and add just a touch so that we have overall shadows a little bit more reddish, and I can add a bit more in the highlights, but some other hue, bit more in the direction of yellow, and add some chroma to that. As you can see, we have immediately a bit more orangey look. And to be able to enhance that, we want to desaturate a little bit the original colors, and you can do that with linear chroma grading. So I can go a bit down with global chroma, and now add a bit global saturation, and through the global saturation we are increasing the saturation with those 4-ways tab. Maybe just a touch of the contrast color in the global offset. Let me see. So that way I'm avoiding to have poor black. I would like to have a bit more different color. Maybe like that, but I think we have too much saturation, so let's go back. There. That's just if you have a freedom to play a little bit with color grading, which I like. I have the options. And another thing that you can also use to your advantage is if you use something in color balance RGB, some kind of contrast sliders here, as I have used here, for example, power and those sliders, you can also use mask to readjust it even better. So, for example, you can move the middle gray fulcrum up and down to be able to see. Maybe I need to add a bit more. Let's use the highlights gain here just to be able to address that better. And now if I move the mask, you see how it shifts from the highlights to the midtones. And now you can also use the fall off functions for shadows to have a smooth transition between shadows and midtones, and also smooth transitions, for example, between the highlights and the midtones. And if you want, we can also have a big steeper transition and so on. So don't be afraid to use also those sliders here if you want to readjust your contrasts. So you have then options to have that nice and soft transitions if you want. And I will go back just a tiny bit with luminance of the global offset, just to have that black point bit down. And actually we're done. We don't need to do anything else. So let's compare that also. Let's compare that side by side. And you can see the difference. This is the filmic version. Of course, I could also do the same thing that I have done with sigmoid, also with filmic. So there is no difference in the approach. I just want to show you that you are also able to do quite a nice portraits with sigmoid. There's no difference in that sense. Okay, I think we are done for today. And if you have some other questions, you be free to ask me in the comment section, or you go to thepixel.us and ask your questions there. And if you have some suggestions, you are free also to make them in the comment section, and I will see in the next episode to see how can we make one video with those suggestions. Okay, thank you for watching, and until the next time.